Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you for joining us. Well, we begin in Lower Manhattan, of course, where 8 people were killed just yesterday in the deadliest terror attack in New York City since 9/11. An active investigation ongoing at the scene near the West Side Highway, and the FBI, working with local police, raided his home in Paterson, New Jersey. Let's get the very latest right now with Maggie Rulli. She's in Lower Manhattan with more.
That terror attack happening just a couple of blocks behind me, and we're now learning that officials have filed terrorism charges against the suspect and that a second person is wanted for questioning.
This whole other side of that bus is caved in.
Today, many parents are left reliving a nightmare. Their children, on their way home on Halloween, became the target of an act of terror.
There's a kid right there.
Authorities now saying this act was planned in advance and believe the suspect, 29-year-old Sayfullo Saipov, was inspired by ISIS propaganda online to rent a Home Depot truck and purposefully barrel down a well-traveled bike path for 3/4 of a mile. Authorities have now filed terrorism charges against Saipov and say they want to bring in a second person for questioning.
We got multiple casualties. This is a mass casualty situation here.
Police credit off-duty police officer Ryan Nash with jumping into action and shooting Saipov, ending his deadly rampage. Officer Nash is now speaking for the first time.
I feel that we were just doing our job like thousands of officers do every day.
Authorities investigating the attack say Saipov left behind a note handwritten in Arabic, seeming to praise the Islamic State.
He appears to have followed almost exactly to a T the instructions that ISIS has put out in its social media channels.
Investigators say he was interviewed in 2015 by federal counterterrorism agents who were looking into 2 other men potentially involved in terrorism. But Saipov was never the focus of any investigation. According to police, he came here in 2010 from Uzbekistan. He lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, Tampa, Florida, and most recently in Paterson, New Jersey, with his wife and 3 children.
We never feared anything because he had a family too.
Authorities are beefing up security in New York and asking the public to step up and report any questionable activity.
That's a minimum of 17 million extra eyes and ears and gut feelings that can remain vigilant on behalf of all of us.
Authorities say so far there is nothing to suggest that Saipov was part of a terror cell or directed by ISIS, and that right now there is no additional threat here in New York City. In New York, Maggie Rulli, ABC News. Back to you guys.
All right, Maggie, thank you. Now, this, of course, is a story that has so many different tentacles throughout our entire region, but it also is a story that has some heroes. One of them, this man, Officer Ryan Nash. He's the officer who shot the suspect after he got out of the truck. If not for his quick action, more lives very well could have been lost. We also heard from the officer Nash just a few minutes ago, the first time we've seen him since the attack. Here he is.
I appreciate the public recognition of the actions of myself and my fellow officers yesterday. Although I feel that we were just doing our job like thousands of officers do every day, I understand the importance of yesterday's events and the role we played, and I'm grateful for the recognition we have received.
And now we move over to Paterson, New Jersey. FIOS 1 visited the Omar Mosque. That is where the suspect is said to have prayed. We were told he only attended services just a few times and was not a regular. We spoke with one of the members who is obviously shaken up.
When you hear about something like this, it's absolutely scary. It doesn't sit well really with anybody or any person from the community. It's scary, and it affects the community in such a horrible way.
So with all this as a backdrop, with an ongoing investigation, I'll bring the attorneys in a little bit to also talk about the charges being filed by the feds today and where this goes from here. You would think politics, let alone discussions of policies, wouldn't be discussed in the immediate aftermath of the attack, but you would be wrong. This morning, President Trump said the following.
We have to get much tougher, we have to get much smarter, and we have to get much less politically correct. We're so politically correct that we're afraid to do anything.
But he went much farther than that. Let me bring in Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent, here to break it down. And again, it wasn't the typical rally the country, pledge of unity, calls for vigilance. It went in directions I haven't seen former presidents go in the wake of a disaster.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in just one second. But there were questions as to, where the president's statement meets the reality there. What really has he done to make us safer? And his supporters would certainly say his immigration policies and some of the other things that he's pushed would be an effort to try to make the country safer. But he has cut funding for anti-terror programs in New York, or at least part of his budget. There have been complaints about
half, by the way.
Yeah, there have been complaints about that from day one, and it's not just the New York area that's been impacted by that. So other than tough talk, there really hasn't been a whole lot that we've gotten from the president in terms of making the country, objectively safer. And that's one of the things that we're waiting to hear more from.
But more than that, there was talk from investigators and people who do this as a profession, certainly in the anti-terror world, and they said, the last thing we want to do right now is create an us and them within the Arab community where we need more intelligence, more cooperation, more help right now. The president certainly went there in terms of who should or shouldn't be in the country here, where he will or won't be able to maybe potentially take this. We'll even talk. The subject of Gitmo was thrown out. He got into that. We'll talk about that later on in the program. But this clearly here is going in directions usually you don't see 24 hours after an attack.
Yeah, that's true. And we got some of that from the president when he was with his cabinet today. And we also got some more of that from the president himself on Twitter. After we went off the air last night, President Trump resumed tweeting about the attack. He then picked it up again this morning. Just before 7, we got the president's most presidential tweet. My thoughts, condolences, and prayers to the victims and families of the New York City terrorist attack. God and your country are with you. But then just a couple of hours later, the president used the attack to push his immigration agenda. I've just ordered Homeland Security to step up our already extreme vetting program. Being politically correct, he tweeted, is fine, but not for this. Then this morning, the tragedy became an all-out political attack. The terrorist, he tweeted, came into our country through what's called the Diversity Visa Lottery Program, a Chuck Schumer beauty. I want merit-based. He followed with another attack. We're fighting hard for merit-based immigration. No more Democrat lottery systems. We must get much tougher and smarter. The president was also watching TV this morning, responding to a Fox and Friends segment with Senator Chuck Schumer helping to import Europe's problems, said Colonel Tony Schaefer. We will stop this craziness at Fox and Friends. Now, responses to the president's tweets came quickly from 2 top New York Democrats.
The president's tweets, I think, were not helpful. I don't think they were factual. I think they tended to point fingers and politicize the situation.
President Trump, instead of politicizing and dividing America, which he always seems to do at times of national tragedy, should be bringing us together and focusing on the real solution, anti-terrorism funding, which he proposed to cut in his most recent budget.
President Trump did reach out to the 2 of those gentlemen today, but had not when they had spoken this morning. Now, for some historical perspective, after 9/11, President Bush didn't get all political. That evening, he addressed the nation, pledging to bring the attackers to justice, but also appealing for unity and bipartisanship. Didn't make any political points or attack any Democrats. 3 days later, he came to ground zero for the photo op that united the city and the nation. Compare that to, well, what we've heard from the president, the current president, in the past 27 hours. One final note, by attacking his critics and pushing for specific policies, the president has, by any objective measure, politicized yesterday's attack. Now, you can argue whether political talk and politicizing things in the wake of tragedies is proper. For example, I've argued on the show that I do think it is proper. But based on the reactions to the president's comments today, many Republicans seem to think it's proper as well. At least they do today.
In one of the most despicable, disgusting displays of politicizing a tragedy that we have ever seen is now happening. In the midst of tragedy, the rush to politicize the worst shooting in American history is shameful. Now, the left has no shame. As we've been showing you night in and night out, this is what the media does. They always find a way, even during a tragedy, to go after the president.
some of those were just from a few weeks ago, Rich.
As a reminder, obviously, the tragedy of the shootings in Las Vegas, where we lost nearly 60 Americans that day. The president said now's not the time to talk about this, but it's far different here. But let me just come back to what we heard, what President Trump said about Schumer, because there's gray areas and then there's truth and there's lies. The Gang of Eight, without getting too much in the weeds, was a bipartisan group of senators, that means Republicans and Democrats, that came up with that policy. Senator Schumer, by the way, a policy that was signed by President then Bush, obviously a Republican. Since then, Schumer tried to have it removed, and with the Republican majority in the Senate, it was not overturned. So the idea that one guy and one party has their fingerprints on our immigration agenda here is completely ridiculous. But moreover, this is the same president who picked 8 countries that didn't hold up in court to have travel bans, and none of them were Uzbekistan. So nothing the president said or wanted to do would have prevented a guy who came in 7 years ago and by all accounts only got radicalized when he was here from what happened yesterday. And to me, there is a convenience of facts. There's lies, and there's a politicization to try and change subjects for what's going on in Washington that I really found distasteful yesterday.
And I would agree with you, Rich. And we got some of that. Jeff Flake, the Republican senator from Arizona, tweeted out responses to some of the president's tweets this morning where he explained, hey, the Gang of Eight was doing this. I was there in the room. There you see the tweets from Senator Flake. You also talked about the distasteful nature of the comments from President Trump. There was an additional soundbite that we have from the president this morning talking about the Democrats. This is almost a throwaway line, but if we have that queued up, Ralph, let's play that quote from the president this morning.
Democrats, because they're obstructionists. And honestly, they don't want to do what's right for our country.
The Democrats are obstructionists. They don't want to do what's right for the country.
And remember, after 9/11, you had George Bush go down to not only ground zero with a hard hat, but also he made it clear that all Americans suffered that day, including people of different faiths, including Muslims, and he said this isn't a time to target. Finally, we saw both in Las Vegas a call from the president not to talk about these things in the aftermath. We also saw in Charlottesville a neo-Nazi plow into a group, injuring 19 people, killing another person as well with a vehicle, and we didn't want to talk about any radicalization at that point. The president, in fact, said that there were good people on both sides. This is not what a president is supposed to do. This is supposed to be about unity, not division at this time, especially with the hypocrisy with the directions he gave us in the last 2 tragedies. I cannot remember such crass politics by any president of any party in the aftermath of something like we saw yesterday.
Let me take it one step further. There is a legitimate need to have a conversation about policies that may or may not have led this guy into the country and what we want to do about it, how we want to respond. Given what we heard from the president, given what we just heard about Democrats and what he said about Chuck Schumer and that soundbite, do you think there's an honest, honorable negotiation to be had, an honest conversation to be had? If you were a Democrat, would you want to enter into that conversation with the president already using it and teeing it up?
I've seen this in 10 months. Never once on someone's watch does he want to take blame for anything. He quickly not only pointed fingers at others, but also lied in the process. All right, coming up next, we'll bring a panel of attorneys to take a look at some of the legal aspects of the attack. There are already calls in Washington to treat the suspect as an enemy combatant. In fact, the president said, maybe we got to put him in Gitmo. We'll debate that and much more after this.